You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And we will be doing lots of politics and public policy this evening because we have as our guest Doug Irwin, who really knows more about Donald Trump and trade than any man, woman, or child alive in the United States. Right, Doug?
A debatable point, but
You're not going to argue with me. He is a professor at Dartmouth College. He is visiting here this week at the Center for the Study of the State and the Economy, more accurately, the George J. Stigler Center for the Study of the State and the Economy at Chicago Booth. That's the Graduate School of Business at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park, south side of Chicago. We're taping on site. So, Doug, more about all of those folks later on. But as we tape, I think this is the 97th day of Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
It's April 26th. Are Mexico and China and Japan killing us? Are they eating our lunch? Are these massive trade deficits the cause of why people are good, honest, hardworking people in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, Trump voters, steel workers, auto workers, unemployed? Should they be blaming these bad trade deals, these stupid people, as Trump would say, who negotiated these bad free trade deals?
No, they should not, because trade is not killing America. There's a lingering effect from the Great Recession of 2009 that has adversely affected a lot of workers in manufacturing, but trade is not a particular problem. For the past 8 years, the trade deficit has been fairly constant as a share of GDP. It's not like imports are surging in. It's not like imports are causing major disruptions for U.S. producers.
How long has that been constant, did you say? The trade
Basically since the Great Recession, so about 2009.
Yeah,
last 10 years or so.
And what if we go back 30 years?
Mm-hmm.
We've had trade deficits, most of those pretty.
We have. Basically since the
last...
early 1980s we've had
Okay.
trade deficits, and it went up in the 80s and then came back down, and then it expanded a lot in the 2000s, but then with the Great Recession it sort of collapsed to a smaller, more sustainable level.
So trade deficits are not the reason why these folks lost their jobs?
Well, there's a new book out called Janesville, and it covers the city in Wisconsin, not too far from here in Chicago, where
Speaker Paul Ryan, it's his district.
It's his district, his hometown, and there is a major GM plant there, and they shut down after the recession, so the recession was the major cause of that dislocation, but then the plant reopened in Texas. So there's a movement of manufacturing within the United States from the Rust Belt down south, from Pennsylvania down south. So
that's number one. Some of those jobs are not lost to the United States, they're lost to those regions, going to other parts of the United States.
Yeah.
But
And
there is this
can I just add, it's not just
that
that they're moving, but it's also that these manufacturing plants are becoming much more efficient and using much better technology. They're using much more capital-intensive methods. They have improved labor productivity, so they need fewer workers to produce the same output.
Right. So independent of trade, things are going on, okay, throughout the world, throughout the country, that's causing shifts in employment. As you say, many fewer people are needed to produce the same amount of output. These are long-time secular trends, whether it's automobiles, whether it's steel, whatever. These folks we're gonna have less demand for their services. We either give them a lump sum payment and say you're a loser. You're not in the Trump sense of it, though. He'd say you're a loser.
Right.
You've lost as a result of this change. We will try to help the people who we can retrain, who we can shift maybe to not as good a job, but something that's better than being unemployed. Maybe it's relocation. Maybe we just give you money and say it's just too late. But that's all we can do. Life, as we know in economics, life is a series of tough choices.
There's a lot to unpack there. So first of all, you're absolutely right that when you look at the share of the labor force in manufacturing, it's been declining since the 1950s. So this is not a new phenomenon. We're moving towards a service sector economy.
And that's not trade, that's just what you just said.
It's like agriculture. So the share of the labor force in agriculture has come way down over the past 2 centuries. It's come down over the last 50, 60, 70 years in manufacturing. And once again, that's largely because we're not consuming as many manufactured goods as we did before, and we can produce those goods with much less labor. So the issue becomes, as we're shifting to a service economy, those who are in manufacturing and are going to be displaced, how do we help them readjust to a service economy? Well, it's a long-term process. So the sons and daughters of workers who are in manufacturing, they're probably not going to, they cannot count on working in manufacturing. they have to move into the service sector. So that as they're younger, they have many more opportunities to get new skills and position themselves for the service economy. The major problem is the older manufacturing workers, who it's going to be very difficult for them to retrain and get into a new sector. But even younger workers in manufacturing, they still have the time to adjust to new conditions.
And even the 50-year-olds. I did see somebody come up, we should say Doug Irwin taught a course, a not-for-credit course, at 2 lunch periods in this week. So students came in from Chicago Booth, the business school. They ate their lunch. They got a free lunch, even though Friedman said there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Tons to fall. There is at Chicago Booth.
Well, actually, I'll say Friedman is right there, because they had to sit and listen to me for an hour.
There
is a cost.
And it was the opportunity cost. They could have been doing something else.
Absolutely.
But it's pretty damn close. Not only did they get to learn about Trump and trade, they did get a free, there was no incremental cost for their lunch.
Mm-hmm.
So seriously, you gave them in 2 hours over 2 days a lot of what we're compressing even more into a half an hour today.
Absolutely.
And you're coming back next fall to teach 2 full-time courses in trade
right.
at Chicago Booth.
Yep, over the entire quarter, so you can get in much more detail on all these issues, because there's a lot of nuances, but a lot of principles to be established as well.
But free trade is a good thing?
Absolutely,
In general.
because no country has done very well by isolating itself and protecting itself from the world economy.
Adam Smith said that over 200 years ago
Yep.
in The Wealth of Nations. It was right then, it's right now.
It's even more right now, because adopt modern technology, and technology differences are very vast across countries, you have to be open to importing it. Back in Adam Smith's day, Britain wasn't terribly advanced over other countries. So trade as a conduit for technological change wasn't that great. But now, particularly for developing countries, now the U.S. is in a little bit of a different situation. We're a big, very robust competitive market, but for any developing country that cuts itself off from world markets, it's not going to do well.
So there's this change in technology that's happening worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying trade helps spread the change in technology from sometimes developed areas to less developed areas, but even the United States benefits from getting some technologies transferred to it that it might not get as fast. There is the concept of comparative advantage, which in essence is what?
Well, it means that countries should specialize in products where they have a relative productivity advantage. So this is an idea that was come up by David Ricardo, who is an economist after Adam Smith. And he was trying to question something Smith was pointing out in terms of technology differences across countries. And it doesn't imply necessarily that a country has to be the most efficient producer of a particular good to be able to export it. They just have to have a relative advantage in doing so vis-a-vis other countries. So the example this applies at the personal level as well. So my wife and I divide our chores in the household. She's superior to me in everything. She's a better cook, better cleaning, better with the kids. So I'm inferior across everything. Now that doesn't mean I can just sit on the couch and let her do everything.
Just in case she's watching the show.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
But there are activities in the household where my margin of inferiority is the least.
Okay,
So
and that's what you should do.
That's what I should do. That's my comparative
inferiority is the
advantage.
least.
Right. So if I'm actually, I think, a decent cook, let's say I'm 10% worse than her as being a cook, but I'm 50% worse than her in organizing the household. Well,
So
clearly,
you're the cook, and she's the organizer.
exactly. Yeah.
So
So this
that-
applies
that's
to countries as well, because
countries,
countries
okay.
can be behind. They can be inferior to other countries in terms of their technology, in terms of their efficiency, but they can still produce and export something and benefit from trade.
What is our comparative advantage, the United States?
We have a very highly skilled workforce. We have the most advanced technology in the world, so we tend to export skilled, labor-intensive, technology-intensive goods.
Like, we're an exporter of higher education. Would that
Yeah,
be true?
that-
People
that's-
come
yeah.
from all over the world to go to Chicago Booth, to go to Dartmouth where you teach, and sometimes they're going to graduate school, sometimes they're going to undergraduate, but higher education, the United States known as, we have a comparative advantage. We do that very well, right?
Absolutely. We probably have an absolute advantage in some sense, but that's an important point, that we export not just goods, but we export services as well.
So all of these trade agreements, we could go back to the general agreement on trade and tariff, the Uruguay round. These are all major multilateral agreements that started after Bretton Woods, after World War II, when we set up a system of I guess, fixed exchange rates.
Yep.
We got it wrong, but then Milton said floating exchange rates.
Right.
And
He
we
did.
now have it right.
Yep.
We have floating exchange rates.
Yep.
But seriously, since 1945 and the end of World War II, we've had a steady growth of multilateral trade. Would that
Right.
be right?
And the reason we have this system is because of the Great Depression and the disaster that occurred during that period. And one contributing factor to the economic chaos during this period was the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which Congress passed in 1930, which led to a retaliation against the United States, a decline in world trade. Other countries followed it and mimicked it and raised trade barriers. Wasn't good for the world economy. And so when President Roosevelt came in, he wanted to open up foreign markets for U.S. exports as a way of getting out of the Depression. And his Secretary of State was by the name of Cordell Hull, who should be much better known to everyone.
We know his name. I know his name.
Okay.
Every kid used to be taught his name, but probably not for the reason you're about to tell us.
Well, he was the longest-serving Secretary of State in U.S. history
That's
from
the reason we're
1933 to
talking about, yeah.
44.
Right.
He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1945 because he helped create the United Nations. But for economists, he's near and dear to our hearts because he helped introduce the idea of reciprocal trade agreements to reduce trade barriers in other countries and in the United States.
Bilateral or multilateral?
Well, initially bilaterally in the 1930s.
So that was the best we could do, but then somebody said, instead of just bilateral, multilateral, you could do it much better.
Exactly.
Right?
So that happened after World War II, and exactly what you were talking about, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade.
And then we had NAFTA,
Yes.
North American
Yep.
Free Trade Agreement,
Yep.
Mexico, Canada,
That's moving
the United
back to
States.
bilateral or regional, but still it's pushing.
Regional better than just bilateral, because you had 3 countries.
Right.
But it's kind of like,
Yeah.
but then, so we've had, NAFTA was 1994.
Mhm.
In the last 20 years or so, have we had this continued growth of trade? And has it been more regional than large multilateral?
Well, there are two things driving the growth of international trade. It's not just trade agreements, it's not just governments reducing trade barriers, but also just economic growth and developments in emerging markets. When they embrace unilaterally more open trade policies, such as China did, they expand their supply on the world market, engage in trade much more, buy a lot of raw materials from the United States, Australia, and what have you. And so it's really, the emerging markets have done very well over the past 20 years, and that accounts for a lot of the growth of international trade.
And that growth outside the United States has helped the United States grow, or has their gain been our loss, as Donald Trump might think?
Oh, it's definitely our gain because we get cheaper textiles, so people can, the price of textiles is actually, and clothing has actually gone down as a share of people's budgets.
So Walmart, which bought a lot of cheap goods and brought them to the United States and still does that and introduced that way of merchandising,
Mhm.
has benefited especially low-income people.
Particularly low-income
Because the portion of their income that's spent on these staples, these products that are lower priced, is higher than for higher income people.
Exactly.
Is that right?
That's right. And also to pay for these, we've had to export Boeing aircraft, General Motors, General Electric engines and machinery, John Deere and farm equipment, Caterpillar earth-moving equipment.
So why doesn't Trump get this? Does he
Well,
get
no.
it? Does he get it and he just wants to say what he thinks is politically feasible? Or do you think he just doesn't get it?
Well, I just gave you the rosy scenario in terms of trade, but there is
Oh,
the
there-
downside
there's
that
a
he's
downside,
yes.
okay.
So when we do import that clothing, well, we used to have a clothing industry here in the United States, and that's shrunk quite a bit because it's just not one can't compete. It's a very labor-intensive
We
industry.
don't have a comparative advantage in that.
We don't have a relative abundance of unskilled labor. It's not our comparative advantage, so we tend to import those goods.
So those people, and a lot of that has been in the South in textiles.
Right.
They become unemployed.
Right. Well,
They-
here's another caveat to that.
Okay.
So we talked about dislocation and workers who are hurt by trade. In the 1990s, when a lot of workers were dislocated from the textile industry and the apparel industry, the economy was booming in the 1990s, and there were a lot of other economic opportunities that were opening up for people in South Carolina and the South more generally, and so people could transition and get good jobs in other manufacturing industries or elsewhere.
Including auto manufacturers. Toyota opened up plants
Yes.
in the southern portions of the United States.
BMW's there, a bunch of others.
So these were, in a sense, perhaps better jobs than the jobs they've lost in many
Yes,
people.
but the problem since 2000 or 2009, certainly since the Great Recession, the financial crisis, is the economy has not been booming and we're not creating those other opportunities for workers. So that makes the transition much more difficult.
So it makes it more difficult, and it also disguises that maybe it's a scapegoat. Instead of Barack Obama standing up and said, really folks, I've been here for 8 years, I helped you come out of the major contraction, well, that's what we call the Depression. He helped us come back from the crash of 2008.
Mm-hmm.
We were losing tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of jobs. That changed. But over most of the last 8 years when he was president, what was our rate of growth? 1.5% a year? After we got past the crash? That's terrible.
Or 2%.
Friedman used to
yeah.
teach, just using rough guesses over 200 years, we've generally probably been close in the United States to 3% per year growth, probably 2.5%. There's a big difference between 3% growth
Absolutely.
and 1.5%.
Right.
So Obama should apologize and say, I think I could have done better. I think we could have had 3% growth. Do you think he should apologize? Do you think he could have had 3% growth? Barack's a great guy. He was here, did 6 shows. This is not bashing Barack, but he can't do everything well, and maybe he didn't get that. Is that possible?
Well, there's a debate about how rapidly the U.S. economy can grow because the labor force is not growing nearly as rapidly because of population increases is naturally much slower.
Well, we have immigration. Some people say that's why even illegal immigration is good because it brings us a labor force when more population is not growing. Are they right?
There's not as much immigration because of the Great Recession. No one's going to come here
So
when
they're not
there
coming
aren't
here
any
now.
jobs.
Okay, so we're not. So that's part of the reason for our low growth.
There's also a debate about technological change and whether technology is advancing, and we're seeing the benefits of that as much.
Really,
but,
even so, with Steve Jobs, who's now passed away, but smartphones, we don't have enough Steve Jobs and Bill Gates around.
Well, this is actually a lot of colleagues here at Booth look at entrepreneurship and whether
there's a center at Booth that deals with entrepreneurship,
exactly.
right?
Yep.
There are institutes.
Yep. And there's a sense that the last 10 years have not been great for new business formation and things of that sort. So that gets into the dynamics of the economy, whether this is a natural phenomenon or whether it's being stifled by government regulation. But let me just make one point on immigration. You said, President Trump has always talked about building this wall to keep Mexicans out. Well, since the 2009 crisis, more Mexicans have left the U.S. than have come in.
So maybe
if we build a wall, we're going to keep them in.
So we don't need the wall now.
I don't think we need a wall.
Probably that's not our biggest problem.
Right.
You do think we should have borders and we should know who's coming into this country, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not just somebody
who
just walk across. We don't need to keep track.
Right.
But you're just saying the major problem is not so much keeping illegal immigrants out. Our major problem in the United States now is increasing the rate of economic growth.
Right.
Do you have that right?
Yep.
And these tariffs. So if Trump sees, as we're taping this in the last few days, we've heard of lumber coming in at low prices. Some say Canada is subsidizing this. Mm-hmm. That's the reason. So our lumber folks can't compete. Dairy people in Wisconsin are saying, I don't know, Canada is subsidizing dairy, so they're driving the price down. You've heard about this?
Yes.
And so Trump's reaction, would you guess, would be to help those industries, and steel is having excess capacity, some would say lower prices, so they want to have tariffs, they want to have import quotas. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Is that what Trump wants to do?
That's absolutely right.
And why doesn't that help? Put a tariff on, all of a sudden, now our dairy industry will do better, our lumber industry will do better, our steel industry. You've studied this now for several decades.
Right.
You've
written probably a half dozen books on trade history. Is that the history? Put slap tariffs on and you get some immediate relief?
No, so it doesn't quite work out that way. Just take some of these cases that you just mentioned. So in terms of dairy, we actually have an export surplus with Canada regarding dairy. So the allegation I've seen on the internet and some news sources is that President Trump saw a Fox News report that interviewed one dairy farmer in Wisconsin who was complaining about something. And so
you cannot generalize, folks. That's why people come to this show, Public Affairs. You can't learn everything. Fox is good, Fox News Channel, my friends, some of them, okay? But you can't learn everything from one anecdotal example.
Right.
You study a whole range of things and try to reach a general conclusion.
Right. So if we have a trade surplus with Canada in terms of dairy products, then there's not really a problem there. We're not being flooded with Canadian milk. Then when you get to softwood lumber, well, first of all, Canada has a lot more timber than the United States does, so they generally have lower costs. This is actually a trade dispute that's been going on since the early 1980s, so it's nothing new. Anytime that this trade dispute has been brought to an impartial panel at the World Trade Organization or the NAFTA tribunals, they've ruled against the U.S. generally. So we don't have a good position here, but the lumber industry is very powerful in the United States. They have the ear of not just Republican administrations, but Democratic administrations as well.
Right. So Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were all sort of reading from the same Bible, right?
Yes.
It's kind of like that. I mean,
mm-hmm.
people had to choose. Hillary had a little bit more history of being a free trader. her husband had pushed NAFTA.
Mhm.
She probably had helped with NAFTA.
She was a little bit more skeptical.
Skeptical.
Yes. Bill's a little bit more of an
But
internationalist.
it seemed like over the years as Secretary of State and under Obama, before the last few years when she started running for president, she was in sync with what Obama was doing. Even Obama had become a free trader after being, as a senator, skeptical, right?
Right. So, as Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton said that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was the gold standard of trade agreements. So she certainly seemed to endorse it there, but then on the campaign trail she said she'd pull out. So actually all the major candidates, Sanders, Trump, Clinton, all said they'd pull out of the TPP.
So why do so many people, it's a bit of a distraction, but let's say, we're taping this at the Center for the Study of the State and the Economy. It's not a physical space. Professor Zingales has his own office. Sarah Nyman is assistant, he's the director. Sarah's the assistant director. They have their own offices. It's more a state of mind. A lot of what they do at the Center for the Study of the State and the Economy, the George Stigler Center for the Study of State and the Economy, is to talk about one of Professor Zingales' favorite topics is crony capitalism, or to talk about regulatory capture, or to talk about how people kind of distort capitalism for their own vested interests. What is that all about? You're here. You're here for this week. You're coming back as a part of the center. They bring you here, right? You're here at Chicago booth. Chicago booth has a lot of free market economics in it. Most of the faculty are probably free market. Just across the street, as we showed you before, if we didn't, we'll show you in some B-roll we've dropped in sometime in the show, is the building of Department of Economics for the University of Chicago, which also houses the Becker-Friedman Institute, Gary Becker, Milton Friedman, and George Stigler. All we're saying is this is the bastion. You are in the bastion of free market economics, right?
Yeah.
What is all that about? What is crony capitalism, regulatory capture, vested interests? Give us like a minute or two on that.
Well, that means that government policy can be captured by special interests that influence policy in Washington.
So we set out the regulators to regulate industry, but then the industry captures the regulators.
Right.
Whether it's the SEC, whether it's the old Civil Aeronautics Board who was supposed to set rates, the airlines use that to have a cartel. So they tend to capture, the industry captures the folks who are supposed to regulate it.
Right. So this is actually one of George Stigler's great insights, and one of his contributions
Right.
is it used to be thought that government regulation was public-minded, in the public interest. And he pointed out that when you look at the SEC or a lot of other regulatory agencies, they're not acting in terms of public interest, they're acting in terms of the clientele that they serve, which is often the industry group. So airlines, for example, before they were deregulated in the late 1970s, if you want to introduce a new airline route, you'd have to get their permission, and they would ask the incumbents, is it okay if this entrant comes in? And they would say no. And that's not serving the consumer interest, that was serving producer interest.
And part of that, when they talk about crony capitalism, it's little favors that are done for capitalists by government, is that what you're saying?
Yes, and in fact, trade policy is an example of that. So the Chicago confectionery industry and the candy industry has been really hurt by the fact that we have restrictions on imports of sugar. Who benefits from those restricted imports of sugar? Well, it's sugar farmers and sugar producers in the South and elsewhere. So they've been able to, in some sense, dictate what federal policy will be to their advantage to the cost of the downstream users of sugar.
So a lot of the trade policy is to the benefit certain people, certain industries, certain firms, but to the detriment of the country at large.
Right.
So maybe we help a few lumber producers, maybe we help a few dairy producers, a few steel firms, but the steel users, which is much larger group of people, much larger part of GDP, they're hurt because we've pushed up the price of steel, and the people who use steel to make cars and other products are hurt. On net, the country's hurt.
Right.
On net, the world is hurt.
Yeah, there are about 150 to 200,000 steel workers in the United States, but there's 6.5 million people working in steel-using industries. And when we jeopardize those downstream jobs when we raise the domestic price of steel, because that makes them a higher cost firm, and they're less able to compete against foreign rivals.
So in a sense, I was going to say, why don't people understand that? But they must, because the people who are hurt have been able to persuade Obama, who wasn't initially a free trader, to become a free trader. Hillary at times to be a free trader. Bill Clinton, these are all Democrats to be free traders. Certainly modern Republicans free traders. But then along comes Donald Trump.
Mhm.
He sees these people in Wisconsin and Michigan, these steel workers, these auto workers. They connect. He makes them some promises.
Mhm.
Can he get, if you could sit down and talk with Donald,
Mhm.
would you say everything to him that you've just said to me? Or is there something that you think might be more effective, might appeal to something of interest to him to get him to back off from these things,
Well,
these tariffs?
one of the most important concepts in all of economics, which I'm sure you learned here and we teach in most of our classes, is the idea of opportunity cost. And you talked about
Right.
that when you talked about free lunch. And I think what people see when we impose a tariff is the benefit to a particular group that's getting protected. But you don't see the opportunity cost, the cost in terms of fewer exports, the cost in terms of fewer downstream jobs, the ramifications. You have to think through not just the first round effects, but how this is going to affect the economy overall.
So
And we're not going to be a rich, progressive 21st century economy if we try to capture the jobs of the 19th century.
He said if you want to get reelected, you need to expand your base. You need to persuade the people that you promised you would help them. You're doing as much as you can, but maybe you can't. Maybe what you intended to do wasn't the best thing. So maybe you could say to these folks, look, some of you folks we can help. We can retrain. We can help you relocate. To the extent we can sometimes help with fixing some aspects of the trade agreements, but that's not the key. We have to get the economic growth rate up. That'll be better for the country. That'll be better for you. You might be able to persuade Trump to go in that direction, possibly.
Possibly because he is interested in economic growth, and there are things that the government can do in terms of tax reform and other things that might facilitate greater business investment and what have you. But the trade policies are sort of an anti-growth policy.
Okay, so in 3 easy steps, what does he have to do on trade or avoid to help the country grow more, not less?
Well, as you said, we're talking in late April, and I was just looking on the internet that the Trump administration has come up with a draft proposal to withdraw from NAFTA, a draft executive order. Doesn't mean they're going to use it, but they have it in their back pocket. I think that's a terrible idea. It's not going to solve any economic problems that the U.S. is facing to withdraw from NAFTA. It's going to create many more.
Tell him and Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, and others who are maybe anti-trade, they need to rethink this, not to have the goodness of their hearts, not to please people like you, but to help Trump get reelected in 3 years, right?
Well, I'm not going to tell them about political strategy. That's not my
Well,
expertise.
if you make people better off, you're more likely to get elected.
If we
And
start a
in your
trade
view,
war,
you make this country better off.
yeah.
Yeah, if you start a trade war, then what?
Well, then it's not going to work out well. So then it does redound to not his advantage. In terms of
And you got to
politics.
get that tax plan. You got to get lower corporate tax rates, lower tax rates across the board. You would tell him that. Get that going, because that's an overall way of improving the economy. That'll help people in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, but throughout the country, and it'll help you, Donald, get reelected. Because if we get this country at 3 or 4% rate of growth, everybody's better off, right?
It is true. Now the question is whether policies will actually achieve that high level of growth, but certainly you don't want to move in the opposite direction, and the trade policies certainly would move in the opposite direction.
You believe in less spending, less taxes, lower tax rates, less regulation, the whole mantra of not just free trade, but free markets?
Well, I do believe in free markets, but you're getting into fiscal and monetary policy, which is a little bit different than free markets per se. So I'm going to stick to trade, which is my area, and leave it to others who are more expert in their
So
fields.
you
about
come
some
back
of the-
next week and every week. We'll try to have Doug Irwin here from Dartmouth College. We'll try to have other people who are equally knowledgeable. You come back next week and every week to Public Affairs, and you'll learn more of what you need to know how to truly make, as Donald Trump would say, this country great again.